Hi, I'm Marissa. She, her pronouns. Is that all we have to do, Teresa?
Drop your emoji of the day in the chat. So, like, how
Will
are you
do.
feeling today? If you could represent it, that would be great. That's our icebreaker for today.
Sounds good. Derek, you're next.
I see a few tired emojis coming into the chat, and that is the one that I personally was going to use also. I am a little tired this morning.
Sorry, are we going around and introducing ourselves or just on the chat? I
Just drop
wasn't.
it in the chat, I think is easier. Thank you for asking. Okay, we have some people feeling happy. We have some people feeling silly. That's great. Okay. And in addition to that, I'm going to have you all answer a poll. I know we have all different kinds of levels of practitioners in this room. We've had a lot of discussions. I feel like this group of folks has a lot of experience and a lot of really good expertise, but I do want to get a sense of what your familiarity and comfort with harm reduction is at this stage. So familiarity with interventions, but also comfort providing those. And I did those separately because I think there is always a disparity there, right? So we might know all about these different interventions, we want to apply them, but maybe we're not as comfortable applying them. And I think we want to maybe talk about that a little bit today so we can support you through that discomfort and hopefully at the end of this training, walking away as better harm reduction practitioners. So I'm going to launch the poll. It is 2 questions. And the first question is, how familiar are you with harm reduction principles and practices? And then second question is, how comfortable are you using these in your practice with folks? And I'm still getting some really interesting emojis. We have a croissant and someone who think I think is that the mind blown one. I'm not sure. But thank you for entertaining that icebreaker. So it looks like we have a good mix of folks in the room. So we have some people that are very familiar, but a large amount of you are saying you're somewhat familiar. And I'm appreciating the honesty when we're talking about comfort with harm reduction, that people are willing to say, like, hey, I'm not comfortable at all. Because I think that comes up a lot for folks. And I think it's important in these trainings to talk about that and process that because it's such a critical set of skills for the group of folks that you're going to be working with, and we have to explore, like, why is it uncomfortable and what should we do about that? How can we get more comfortable? Hopefully this training will contribute to increasing people's comfort with these um interventions, but that's my hope anyway. Okay, give it another minute or two before we close the poll. Okay. So here you can see what the results were once everyone answered, and it sounds like at least some familiarity with everyone in the group, if not very familiar. And then comfort is a range, and that's okay. We're going to work with that today. So like I said, we're going to ease you in this morning with a bit of a video so that you can kind of get a sense of what we are meaning when we're talking about harm reduction. This video is from Sam Rivera. Is he opened the first 2 sanctioned OPCs, overdose prevention centers in the country. I think in 2021 is when he opened them. And this speech talks a little bit about like why he got into harm reduction, what it means to him, and the approach, and also kind of the impact providing services in the way that he does has had on people over time. And so I want us to give this a listen, and then I have some discussion questions that we can dive into afterwards. So hopefully the sound will work.
Using drugs. Going when she was working in the emergency room. I grew up on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. And back then, drugs were really about every day of our lives. And she was working with this guy who was a drug, using drugs. He was there every day. And I said to her, Mom, like, why do you keep helping this guy? Like, he doesn't care about himself. And she said, my job is to help.
Oh, the audio just went out.
Yeah, we can't hear it now, Teresa.
Some of us in this room used to have fun.
Hold on. Sorry about that.
Like, he doesn't care about himself.
Can you
And
hear
she said,
now?
my job is to help him.
Yes.
Yeah, we can now.
Thank you.
And that is really what I carried in my career. And in my career, and what we do at On Point, is we love on people until they're ready to love on themselves. And really understanding why people use and where that comes from. Maybe some of us in this room used to have fun. Our participants used to self-medicate pain, trauma, and mental health conditions for the most part. We've been running OPCs for over 2 years. I've yet to have a participant come in the room and use and say, oh, I feel great. I'm nice and high. What they say when they walk into the room is, I need to get well. I'm in pain. So it's been interesting first day here because we had this amazing session after the very good, excellent keynote yesterday morning, and talking about including people and working with people. Then I went to another session where a young man expressed his concerns about working with police, which is a real concern. And a number of people in the room were basically wanting to throw him out of the room. So I don't know how we transition from a session that says we want people, we want to be inclusive and work with people, and then go in another room and when the young man expresses his pain and maybe his experience with police, we want to throw him out of the room. So we want to figure out how do we work with both, right? And too many times we talk about what's so different, what our issues are, what's so different about us, instead of what do we have in common? What brings us to this work? How do we move this madness in this world we've been living in to support people where they truly are? So my title is, We Are the Medicine, and sort of where it started. I want to give you a brief history. So it said I've been doing this work 31 years. I was like 11 or something when I started, 12, something like that. I think it was 10 and a half, but it's actually 32 years this year. But so I was doing HIV work. I was in the work of HIV. I was a member of ACT UP. Really groomed me to be who I am today. If you don't know ACT UP, get on your phone. As we say in Puerto Rican, Googlealo. Just means Google it. Puerto Ricans think Google is the English word for search. So you can search it. ACT UP changed this world. ACT UP brought people together in a loving way to represent people who weren't represented, who were dehumanized for who they are, not their behaviors. Let's watch our language. So I would work during the day and then go home and then change and go into shooting galleries to clean syringes out of buckets with bleach. And a number of us were doing this. We were supporting people in that loving way, not realizing we were just starting this thing called harm reduction. So I ask those of you who are in harm reduction, who are truly in harm reduction, because we have a lot of harm reduction light going on, like Splendor harm reduction. We have a number of people like starting to talk about harm reduction, and they don't really understand how deep that word is and what it means to us. But that was the beginning of harm reduction. It was about loving these folks who were treated differently simply because of who they are. And we're back here again, watching this happen again and again. And so I look back to those days, they were very different. They were amazing, they were painful. Funerals every week, sometimes twice a day. We were losing so many people. And at the same time, we were creating this new way of blessing and taking care of people. We talk about, I like to say, we are the medicine. And in Native culture, medicine is a big word for us. And oftentimes we've also had to deal with having people tell us that our medicine is our drugs. Do you imagine that? What we do in ceremony to heal and get well, we have these created these categories that make our medicine drugs. And we've been through that so many times. Big Pharma is allowed to do it differently, right? So maybe they should come to a powwow or some ayahuasca ceremony, and we'll help them create a medicine they can put their name on. And I don't mean that at all. So on 11/30/2021, we opened the first 2 OPCs in the United States. We're supposed to clap. November 30th, 2021, we opened the first 2 overdose prevention centers in the United States. And it was crazy. It was like, can I curse? It was crazy. It was intense. It was serious. It was beautiful. It was dangerous, you know? And we had we had an idea of what we were doing for our people, because that's what it's all about. It has nothing to do with us. It's about our participants. What we knew is when we opened, we didn't open. On Point didn't open by ourselves. Too many lives lost. Too many people hurt by this process. You know, they say there's a war on drugs in this country. There is no war on drugs in this country. There is a war on drug users. In fact, there's a war on specific drug users, Black, brown, and poor white folks. Let's follow the bouncing ball. Specific drugs are allowed to enter specific neighborhoods. Those people use and sell those drugs, and then they're punished for doing so. That's what they call the drug war in this country. There is no drug war. Let's learn that. So when you hear people say no more drug war, they're not talking about the one that the federal government likes to talk about. They're talking about the one we experience on the ground and our beautiful people have to fight through every day. When we opened the OPC, at every booth, we put a candle and we let it stay there for all those who couldn't use the OPC, who weren't able to be there and stay alive in our program and be treated with humanity and love. You know, in our booth, we have these big mirrors. It's one of my favorite things to watch. We have these big mirrors where we watch people after they use to see if they're overdosing. And I remember when we first opened, a lot of people, especially women, didn't want to look at the mirrors. They didn't want to look at themselves. They would put things in the way. They didn't like the way they look. Harm reduction is about this. Those same women sit there and put makeup on in the same mirror. They see themselves. They love themselves. They're building a relationship with the woman they were ashamed of looking at in that mirror just months before. In that room, this community. When people use, and when our people use, they have to hide. It's quick. They have to get it done really quickly and hide from people in an alley, in a park, in a bathroom. With us, they get to relax and use safely. We are blessed for, they allow us to work with them. We're blessed because they allow us to work with them. It is a privilege to be able to provide those services. We get in this room. For a long time, I thanked Will Smith for slapping Chris Rock. It's real. I'm not kidding. It's real. Not because he did it, but because in the room, he participated in the reduction of drug use. He participated in the reduction of drug use in the room because when someone comes in, they tell us what they're using, how much they're using, how they're using it, right? So they come in the room and they say, I'm using 2 bags, I'm injecting, so on. And then they use their first bag, they're chilling, everything's good. And then a conversation comes up. Why did he smack him? And everybody starts giving their opinion. and they're going to use their second bag. And I'm like, if I use the second bag, I won't be able to give my opinion, and my opinion matters. So I'm going to use this later and express why. And those are things, sports, politics, all kinds of things like that participate in the reduction of drug use.
Okay, I hope you enjoyed that clip as much as I did. I found it to be really, really powerful when I watched it. And I feel like I used it in this presentation because I feel like it is a good segue into talking about stigma, but also talking about what the core and the spirit of harm reduction is. So having watched that, I just have a few discussion questions so we can reflect a little bit before we move on. And the first question is, and you can come off mute. Invite you to do that. Also, you can put it in the chat if you would prefer to do that. So how does Rivera's approach to dignity and care resonate with you or challenge your experience of working with people who use drugs? And I'll give it a minute for you to answer because that's kind of a big question, but I think it's really important for this purpose. I didn't want to give this training today and just kind of go over like all of the strategies that a number of you are familiar with just as interventions without really focusing in on what the spirit of this work is. And so yeah, that's why I want to start with this discussion. I want to start with this reflection. I want to talk a little bit about our discomfort, and then we'll tee you up to talk about the interventions you can use.
Yeah, it was a great video. I think drug use, especially right now, like heroin and fentanyl, and crack, just, the amount of vocabulary out there in society that we use to stigmatize people, and like really harsh words that people use on the daily, are really, and we really treat people pretty poorly as soon as they say that they're a drug user, and they're people, and they're my clients, and they're amazing. And you can have, I think the part where like talking about something like Will Smith and that whole thing really stuck with me, because we have really awesome, funny conversations, and like, it's really great just to talk to people one-on-one and move past that and get past those stigmas. And yeah, they deserve help, and they're very vulnerable, and we can't just treat them as all the vocabulary that we throw out there every day to dehumanize these individuals.
Absolutely. Thank you for saying that. And I think I loved that example too. I at first had wanted to stop it a little earlier with the powerful example around the women, but then that example, I think for me, lifts up how harm reduction is so much more than interventions. It's also the community that it creates, right? And the seeing people, and I see some answers in the chat. Travis said, what resonates is his empathy, his compassion and humanity, and seeing people and not the behavior. And I think like that is so core to it. And it sounds a little like when you say it out loud, it's like, of course they're people, but I think we all know, having done this work, that people, when they're labeled as someone that uses substances, they might get treated as less than or as less capable. And the fact of the matter is, we don't get to decide what people are capable of. We get to partner with them, walk alongside them as they make those choices, and as they show us what they're capable of. And so I love those examples, and I really loved the humanity that he brings to the work. And that is like the core to the spirit of harm reduction. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But I think next I want to talk about that stigma that, thank you, Derek, you brought up, and talk about how damaging that is, and how it impacts the people that we work with. And so stigma does a number of things. I think we're actively seeing what's going on as described in this first bullet here, which is the lack of prioritization for funding for culturally responsive systems of care. We're especially kind of seeing people walking back from harm reduction right now, in kind of like a knee-jerk and reactive way, which is a big problem. We should really be kind of like leaning into this because we know that it has contributed to what we're seeing across the country in terms of reduction of overdose deaths. But stigma also just helps, it prevents, excuse me, people from getting the care they need, which can be deadly. Like if someone is so afraid of how they're going to be treated, say like after they experience a return to use or after they kind of their substance use goes from like non-problematic to maybe problematic. If they're too afraid to about how they're going to be treated to even ask for the help, well, that's a problem, right? Help can be any kind of help, but we know that less than 10% of the population even reaches out to get the support that they need, and that's complicated, right? It's not just one thing. It is access, it's quality of the help that is available, which is in this country. But it's very driven also by that stigma. It's very driven about the judgments that we pass on people when we learn that they use drugs as a society. When I say we, that's what I mean. And so there was a recent huge study that showed that a lot of folks who had, oh, sorry, I'm doing my own slides today because, all right. There's a huge study that showed that people who passed away from overdose, only 51% had accessed treatment in the 12 months prior. And that's talking about like traditional treatment, MOUD, inpatient treatment. And so it also highlights the critical importance of harm reduction, right? Because while they might not be touching the treatment system, they may be touching the harm reduction system. And it just lifts up the importance of how critical it is to support people where they're at and create that community, and support them in any positive change. Because we know that the larger system is it's failing people who use drugs. And so to kind of like bring it full circle, having seen the video, but also thinking about the results in your poll, like some folks said, I'm not comfortable with harm reduction interventions, even though I am familiar with them. And again, like that is something that you see, and I hope that we can kind of talk a little bit about today is, what do you think? So one, do you fully embrace harm reduction? And if you feel like there's something that's getting in the way of you being comfortable with those interventions, what is that? Like, can you identify what it is that makes you uncomfortable? Is it familiarity? Is like what is driving that? And I know I'm asking people to be a little brave and vulnerable by asking about this, but I think it's really an important discussion.
I'm sure like fear has a lot to do with that. And it's the stigmatization, whether you resonate with the values that go into that portrayal of somebody or not, like you do internalize all of this fear that somebody's unpredictable and could potentially like, harm you or do something unexpected. And I think that prevents people from sort of knowing how to use their gut when they're approaching an individual. Um, and that can be healthy in some ways, and then otherwise we have to challenge ourselves to say, am I actually like in any harm's way here or not?
Yeah, that's a really good example. So it's like, am I actually in any harm's way? Or is it that everything I've been taught to believe about people who use drugs are kind of clouding my judgment about what potential risk there is, right? Because I think a lot of we all were alive in the This Is Your Brain and Drugs campaign time, I think. Or maybe I'm dating myself, but I think I like vividly recall a video where they showed this kid who was allegedly on substances being really aggressive. And that's what was kind of just disseminated to all of us at that point in time. And a lot of us were probably starting to develop our ideas and thoughts about things when at that age when that was widely shared, like on from the federal government all over TV, right? And so those things cloud our judgment, and I think unfortunately can lead to a different perception of risk, right? And so I appreciate you saying that and really like digging into kind of the self work about, okay, am I in danger, or am I acting on these like biases that I have? And I don't say that in a shamey way. I say that in a way that that's been fed to us for so long that we have to actively challenge that. And so you've seen this slide before if you were in our motivational interviewing training, but I think just to put it up again quickly to remind folks that our definitions as providers of safety and for the people that we're working with might not always align, right? And so sometimes agencies can really be risk averse, and sometimes our perception of risk and safety, we define it one way and maybe the person we're working with defines it another way. And often at the core of that, safety for a person that we're working with means maximizing control over their own lives. And that makes a lot of sense in the context of this program, right? Because if people are in shelter or living outside prior to transitioning into housing, there are things that are kind of threatening their own control over their lives, whether that's they have to follow a bunch of rules to get the services that they need, whether that's you can sleep here, you can't sleep here, clearing encampments, managing that. And so I think, John, the example that you used really kind of set this slide up, which is like, let's think about risk versus autonomy, right? And of course, there's times where risk is imminent and there's something we have to do. But I think when we're talking about harm reduction, the core is maximizing people's control over their own lives and their autonomy. And so, how do we make sure that we're assessing for risk, but also assessing our perception of risk? So I just wanted to cover that quickly before we segue into what the spirit of harm reduction really is. I think you heard a lot about it in the video that we just saw. But again, I think I've been doing these trainings for a long time. I've done a bunch of different harm reduction trainings. I have tried so many different ways to get at like the core of the spirit, because I think whenever I attend these, I feel like that's kind of what is missing, and it's really hard to teach because it's kind of a belief system. But I'm going to do my best, and I hope that some of this lands because it's so important. Because I think, the joke that Sam Rivera made in that movie was there's like Splenda, harm reduction light going on out there, which I loved that analogy. I thought that was great. But that's, I think, because we sometimes focus so much on the strategies that we forget to focus on the spirit. And in harm reduction, the spirit really is the intervention. Like that is at the core of the intervention. The spirit is that radical acceptance of the person in front of you, regardless of what their substance use status is, right? It's being non-judgmental. It's instilling hope for whatever change that person wants to make. It does not have to be related to their substance use, but it could be because some people do want to change that. It's dignity and respect, like unwavering dignity and respect. It's being seen. I think as Travis brought up in the chat, right? Being seen beyond substance use, which again, like it feels silly to say out loud, but that's what the world is like right now. And I think that impacts people a lot. It's also, this is really important, and we'll get a little bit more into why, is restoring people's power. So a lot of folks have been in situations where their power was taken away, whether they belong to a marginalized group, they were incarcerated related to their substance use. Similarly, like I just said a slide ago, like maybe they're living outside and they're being told where they can and can't be. And so part of harm reduction is restoring people's power and autonomy. And then lastly, it's building that community, right? It's a place where people belong, and we know belonging is like core to healing. So again, like we could talk about all day about the different interventions, but if the spirit is not under those interventions, if we kind of can't align with that, then we're only going to make it so far. I'm never going to say like, oh, giving naloxone is bad if you don't have the spirit of harm reduction. Like, nope, give people tools no matter what. But if we can't like get with the spirit piece, our capacity and our abilities are going to be limited in engaging with people who use drugs because of the harms the system has done to them that we do not want to continue to do. So another question for the group. So how do you maintain the spirit or this approach in your work? And what makes it, if there's anything, what makes it hard to do that? I saw some things in the chat earlier that kind of named like it's hard. So not always easy to see beyond the behavior. Molly, you mentioned it can be hard to maintain when it's prolonged. So I'm wondering if people can say a little bit more about like how do you maintain that approach in your work? And also like what makes it challenging?
I think a thing that makes it challenging is when it's not the primary, when your primary work is not working around people dealing with addictions and active use. Sometimes it makes it hard to know what the right thing to do is, and you can take harm reduction classes, and then having it stick with you, or like knowing what the right thing to do is hard when you're not doing it all the time. It's hard enough remembering all the things you have to do that you do over and over again, and so I think there's a fear of doing something wrong, doing it the wrong way, or making a mistake, or putting other people at risk when you're in a situation where people are coming into a busy waiting room or something like that. And I think that's something that we have experienced here, trying to figure out what is the right way. And then the other thing is like, when is it, knowing when other help is needed sometimes is really challenging too.
Yeah, absolutely. I think knowing when to bring in more resources, it is sometimes feels like if you're not doing it all the time, it feels like a whole separate set of skills. And I think you're getting to what we were talking about earlier, which is, yeah, there is, we acknowledge, and part of harm reduction is you do acknowledge there's risks related to substance use, and you're in a position where you're caring for this person, you're working with this person, and you want to see them be safe. And so trying to make sure that we're doing that in a way that is not harmful and that promotes people's autonomy, promotes people's wellness is tricky, and it's a fine line to walk sometimes. So I appreciate you saying that. And yeah, I can imagine, I think a lot of my past work is in this space, but I can imagine if I was having to shift between a lot of different approaches, that could be hard. It is like a whole different set of skills, but I will give some resources for that later. In the chat, I see radical acceptance makes it easier to maintain the approach. Yeah, absolutely. So that's just that, like, if you're familiar with DBT, radical acceptance is like, I'm accepting you as you are right now, no kind of expectation for change. Like, I give you my dignity, respect, and regard right exactly where you are. And a couple of things that make it harder. Yep, when other people, kind of like Ramsey, you said, when other people are around, and especially children, and worrying about the risk there when housing is precarious. Travis said, incorporate into your work and encouraging connecting to organizations specializing in mental health and substance use has been an increasing focus. And Ryan, anger and pain helps me to continue to present with compassion and understanding difficult situations. Yeah, it can be hard when actions jeopardize your own personal boundaries that you might, yeah, I think totally. So kind of holding people's pain and being with them to experience that it can be hard. And yeah, the engagement piece, it can be harder to engage sometimes. It depends. I think one thing I hope we take away from harm reduction is that it is an effective strategy to engage folks who otherwise might be difficult to engage, because I think sometimes, and sure, sometimes it might be substance use, but sometimes the reluctance to engage is that stigma and shame, right? So it's what they think you're going to think about them if they disclose their substance use. So if we can keep with the spirit, and if we can keep with the like the approach of harm reduction and those interventions, a lot of times that you'll see your engagement, if you're doing it really well, your engagement with people who use drugs will get better, because you are kind of actively combating with this approach the stigma and the shame that people experience.
I think kind of more of what I was speaking, that is true. What's hard is if they continuously struggle to come in sober. So they don't remember the meetings we had, or they don't necessarily understand everything that's going on in those moments. And it's hard when they're not ready yet to take those steps, or, what they need to do. Or if we're having a hard time with a few people figuring out how to support them with this approach.
Yeah, I think it would be tough if the person doesn't really understand what the next steps are because they couldn't fully participate. I think, again, like I feel like this is all very nuanced and it can be a fine line. Sometimes people are totally able to be present and other times they're not, and that kind of depends on the day. And I think when I think about that, I think about, okay, so how are we going to work with this person and get information about, like, when's the best time we can talk about this? What's the best way to follow up? And how can we continue to make steps forwards? But it's tough. It can
Yeah.
be tough.
And he does, the person I'm thinking of right now, like, does come in. So he's
Yeah,
built
that's
relationships.
good.
So, what I tell my staff is to, keep that rolling, keep trying to build that relationship until maybe we can have those harder conversations in a way that resonates a little bit more. Because this person is definitely still in that place of not quite trusting or wanting to
Yeah.
put out everything that's going on.
Yeah,
So.
absolutely. And that's,
But he's getting to know more of us in the office as he goes. So, next time he comes in, I said, pull me in too and see if both of us could sit down and have a conversation with him too to see if that helps.
yeah, that's a great approach.
Different ways, different strategies.
Absolutely. And I think, thank you for kind of centering the relationship in that discussion, because I think, again, that's core to this, right? You're valuing that person, you're wanting to continue to engage, and you are working with your team to make that possible. Oh, I see one more in the chat. Yeah, I think, and we'll talk about this a little bit later about kind of what some strategies might be to create one, I think creating the safe space by creating the culture, right? And then the other piece is, like finding and giving people space if they are having challenges related to their substance use, because it does happen. But I
Teresa,
think other,
oops,
oh,
sorry. Oh, I was
okay,
gonna,
you wanna
I was
go?
gonna just say, like, trust building can be due to so many stigmas in substance use. Being, being from the service provider world, it can be earning trust from individuals and having them, come out and tell you that they're using, how much they're using is a big step for a lot of folks,
Yep.
because it's hard to earn that trust, and a lot of my clients see us as, we're service providers, built into the system, and it's definitely harm reduction is new for a lot of people. And I think a lot of folks that are using right now have that old model of,
Yep.
drug use, of, like, drug war, like,
Yep.
and I give a lot of credit to my clients when we can get to that trust spot where they can openly talk to me about it. And we should give them a lot of credit for when they're able to do that too, because it's not an easy step.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that. That's so true. And I think, I mean, how many times throughout your career, if you have you been in situations where you observed a service provider withholding services because someone was using substances, or like, you can't even come in if you're under the influence. Like that one, it's still present, it's still out there, it's still happening. But it also used to happen a lot more. And so as we're trying to make this shift into something that's more helpful and holistic and caring, we have to remember that that's probably a lot of people's past experiences. So why should they trust me? And I think so. I appreciate you saying that that trust is hard earned, and it takes a lot of time and consistency for sure, and then really just that non-judgmental approach. And just to kind of talk about, like, in this context, when we're talking about harm reduction, we will be talking about it generally, harm reduction and overdose prevention, but we'll also be talking about it in terms of how do we preserve people's housing once they've transitioned in, and that we're not necessarily trying to get people to stop using all substances unless that's the person's own goal, but we are trying to reduce harm, and one way to reduce harm is to make sure people remain housed, right? No one is going to be doing better if they lose their housing, and so what are strategies for that, which we will, like I said, in kind of like the second half after your break, we'll talk about. And we have to kind of be cognizant of what we do and don't have control over while we're doing this work. And one of those things is people's choices around their substance use. We don't have control over that. We can meet them where they're at and kind of have those discussions, but ultimately that's someone else's decision. And similarly, when we're talking about landlords, neighbors, we don't have control over their reactions. What we do have control over, and what we will talk about later today, is our interventions and making sure they're aligned with where the person is at. Checking our biases, which I'm like so happy to hear people in this group talking about that, and talking about how they're working with that, because I think that's something that can really get in the way of this approach. And then we can utilize our assessment plan and our safety planning to kind of work with the person regardless of their situation, and promote their safety. All right, so we're going to pivot a little bit, kind of just to give a little bit of information on what substance use is looking like in the country and also in Vermont, and to give some kind of just some context. So currently, we're actually seeing overdose deaths decreasing in many places, not all places, but a lot of places in the US. But in most cases, marginalized groups are not decreasing, and the overdose death rates in some cases are increasing. We know that's particularly true for Indigenous communities, older adults, and Black men in particular. And so that's kind of showing us that while we've made a lot of progress, we kind of can't pat ourselves on the back yet, right? We have to dig in and examine. And I think once we get to like the history section of harm reduction, it will be kind of clearer why these communities are not as trusting of the system. They're not as reached. Some states have been able to make an impact. Like New Jersey and Massachusetts, for example, did actually see declining rates across all racial and ethnic groups. And they used kind of a equity-based approach to achieve that, and kind of involving community. And so we are making some progress. We've also kind of, I guess, I don't want to say made steps backwards, but if we're not reaching all community members, like that is still a problem and something we really need to attend to. And then lastly, I think I'm sure you all know that the substance use landscape is evolving quite a bit right now. So there's lots of adulterants in the drug supply. There's lots of fentanyl showing up in like stimulants in places where you wouldn't always expect it to be. And all of these things pose new challenges. They pose challenges in the way that we respond to overdoses. They pose challenges in the way that we treat folks, and they pose challenges in kind of, I just keeping up, I think, is one thing, right? Keeping up with all the changes and approaches based on what is happening with the drug supply. That's hard. It's rapidly evolving. And then lastly, just since we're talking about all substances, just a reminder that alcohol is still the most deadly drug in the United States. And sometimes that gets overlooked because we talk about the opioid crisis, but we shouldn't overlook that because it is a challenge and it does pose challenges to tendency support, which is one of the things that you all will be working on with folks on. So in Vermont specifically, you did, like the rest of the country, experience a decrease in overdose deaths. This is from your dashboard, which if you haven't visited that, it's great. It has a lot of good information. You saw an increase in stimulant involvement in opioid related deaths. And I think, generally when we see that, people aren't always, sometimes they are, but people aren't always expecting, fentanyl in their stimulant supply. And so we have seen a lot of folks who have experienced an overdose because they were getting something other than what they thought they were getting. Maybe they thought they were getting cocaine and there was fentanyl in it. And that can obviously, for obvious reasons, lead to an overdose. We have seen an increase in xylazine in your supply, which comes with its own challenges. It puts people at a lot of risk because it's very sedating. It creates the wounds that we all talk in here about. And it comes with its own host of different needs and different responses. And lastly, there wasn't a ton of information about the racial disparities in Vermont. I know it's a kind of heavily white state. So right now, white folks are most impacted, but I think it would be interesting to try to dig into how other communities in Vermont are impacted and whether there's disparities there. And here's just, again, this is from your dashboard. So it talks about all the progress that Vermont has made. And I just wanted to kind of give a nod to that because there is quite a bit going on. And, clearly some of this has led to sort of like you're seeing decreased rates in fatalities. So we saw in 2019, testing for xylazine, decriminalization of buprenorphine possession, elimination of the waiver, community drug checking, mail-based naloxone, all of those things definitely had an impact, right, in the progress that you've made as a state. And so moving from kind of the history of Vermont's policy interventions in harm reduction, we can pivot into like the history of prohibition and harm reduction. And the reason I like to go over this just briefly, I'm not going to go over every act. I don't think. I'm just going to send them out in the slide so you can have the information. But we want to think about like kind of like how far back prohibition has gone and the impacts of that. So you can see starting in the 1870s that a number of acts were put into place to quote unquote regulate opium and marijuana. Also alcohol, right? Prohibition. And that continued, honestly continues to the present day. This is kind of like the history of the drug war that was referenced in the video that we watched. And the reason that we kind of show this slide is just so people understand how extensive and how repetitive kind of negative actions against people who use drugs have been perpetuated. And the interesting part of this, and again, I'm not going to go through every single one of these, but every time a new act was put into place, it was generally in response to a group of folks that are immigrating from a different country or to folks that are indigenous, right? So with the Marijuana Tax Act, you see that it was disproportionately enforced against folks who immigrated from Mexico. The Opium Exclusion Act, disproportionately enforced with folks who immigrated from China. Prohibition, disproportionately enforced in Black, Brown, Indigenous, and poor communities. And so I think you can probably see a pattern here. And that pattern is that we utilized a lot of this to target certain racial and ethnic groups historically, or it was just enforced differently due to systemic racism. And it gives you a pretty clear picture about why we're seeing disparities still today. So if you have like 100 years plus of folks targeting certain communities with this type of legislation, it really kind of destroys trust in a system that's supposed to help. And then the other piece to that is like, I think we're all familiar with the fact that this huge like push for harm reduction and treatment not punishment really kind of came around as a result of white folks dying, and it ignored communities of color for a really long time. And so we're still kind of participating in this. We're still engaging in mass incarceration of folks that use substances. And I say that so that we keep in mind that there are very clear reasons for the disparities that we're seeing, and there's like a lot of work to undo that. And we're gonna have to think about how we're shifting our approach, and highlights even more like the challenges building trust with certain groups of folks who have substance use disorder. And then lastly, a little bit about the history of harm reduction. And I bring this up because again, when I think about the spirit, I also think about it as like a real movement that came from being marginalized and oppression, right? And so 1960s and 70s, communities were practicing informal harm reduction practices and peer education, right? So kind of under the radar, peer-to-peer mutual aid is like the foundation of the harm reduction movement. And so we know that, there was like the Black Panthers did some of this. We know some early examples of LGBTQIA2S folks doing this, especially trans women of color. And then it kind of increased and got more formalized in the HIV/AIDS crisis. And with that activism, so it established some of the first syringe service programs formally, not informally or in mutual aid. And it continued to kind of spread across the globe. And certainly certain countries have really surpassed the US in their approaches to harm reduction and utilization of harm reduction. And it gained traction again during the opioid crisis. And the last bullet is saying how we're mainstreaming it, but I know that there are some threats to that right now under the current administration. Okay, so last thing before we break, and then I pass it over to our guest presenter. Just a refresher on harm reduction. And so the first question I want to ask is, what's one way harm reduction in your own life? And you can put it in the chat, you can come off chat. It's up to you.
I have like just, open communication with my clients and just, overall trust building prior to, having tough conversations about substance use. Also, I'm an EMT, so I've, provided wound care and just, not allowing that, or allowing my clients to know that, like, I'm not stigmatizing them.
Thank you, Anne. What else? And then I think the other way of thinking about this question is not just how we apply it to the work, but like, what about our own lives? Perfect, Ryan. That's like a very common one. Making a plan on where I'm going to sleep if I plan on drinking and can't walk home or drive home. It's a very responsible and very common harm reduction intervention, right? And then, yep, Molly, seatbelts, helmets. There are a lot of people that I don't know, like another common one is drinking water in alcoholic beverages. Choosing one that's lower percentage of alcohol. Like all of these things are things that like we do. And I think the reason I asked this question is I wanted us to think more broadly about harm reduction, and not just kind of pigeonhole it into talking about people who inject drugs, although that like is a big piece of what we will talk about today. So thank you for those answers. And this, again, as a refresher, and I think folks might be familiar with this, but we think about harm reduction as a framework kind of in three ways. And so first way, and this is just full disclosure, fully stolen from National Harm Reduction Coalition. You can see it linked there. And actually, when I send these out, if you click on the image, it will be linked because I think I had like 4 slides on this. And then I found this graphic and I was like, wow, they did it way better than I ever possibly could. So let me just present it in this concise way. So I think first is the harm reduction movement, right? So that is a social justice movement, and it's focused on the restoration of power to people who have been disenfranchised for a variety of reasons. This doesn't have to just be substance use, right? So we want to shift power and resources, and that's why autonomy is so important, right? And choice in harm reduction. We want to shift the resources to people most vulnerable to structural violence. Little HR harm reduction, that's like the things that I think we tend to go to immediately, which is the interventions in like the belief on how to provide services. So that's that spirit that we talked about. And then there's risk reduction, and those are the tools. So those are like when you're giving fentanyl test strips, when you're giving naloxone, like those are the risk reduction tools. But we have to remember kind of like there's layers to this, right? And so we kind of have to buy into the philosophical piece. We want to buy into the approach or the spirit that we talked about. And then we want to know the tools, because when it does come time for folks to have that discussion with us, we want to have the right information to give them. Let's see, Kimber says, oh, where did it go? Says, this is Vermont, and I know there has to be some people in here who are buying weed from distro. You no longer have to manage the risks of buying it on the streets of someone else. Thank you for saying that. So my harm reduction example is I have a really hard time sleeping. I have since I was like 12 years old, right? And so like you use medication to address that, right? And there's no medication that I found helpful, not just helpful, but like I don't know if anyone else has ever tried Ambien or had that prescribed to you, but I was like sleepwalking and doing stuff in my sleep that was dangerous. Okay, so speaking of weed's legal in Massachusetts too. I take a gummy every night. It doesn't make me feel intoxicated. It makes me go to sleep, and I don't get up and try to like cook and walk down the stairs while I'm sleeping. And so I want to share that for a few reasons. One is it's just an example of harm reduction that I would bet thousands of dollars that other people in this room are using. And two, it's going to get to something in the principles, which is people use all different kinds of drugs for all different kinds of reasons, right? And then I think the one point that I wanted to make that wasn't on the past slide is that harm reduction is more than just the tools that reduce risk, it's the tools that promote health, just as importantly, right? So I think one of our stigmatized beliefs sometimes is, oh, they're using substances, they couldn't possibly care about their health. Well, that's not true, right? That's not true at all. People care about their health regardless of substance use. And so we want to be cognizant of making sure that we're not withholding, we're not kind of like buying into that narrative. We're not withholding services or solutions just because that's a bias that maybe we have. And we want to always be offering health promoting strategies because harm reduction is a critical touch point, and we know it reduces mortality, and we know it provides a lot of tools. Like your local SSP syringe service program is not just doing syringe exchange. They are doing testing, they are doing referrals to medication, they might be doing counseling. There's a whole host of health promotion services that are a piece of harm reduction that I want to make sure that we don't forget about. And so here are the key principles. I'm sure that you have heard these before, but first and foremost, and kind of why I self-disclosed about my sleep problems, is all kinds of people use substances for all different reasons. And it can be recreational, it can be cultural, spiritual, and not all substance use is problematic, right? I think we think about that like total abstinence versus substance use dichotomy when it's not actually how it works, right? It's more of a spectrum. People can fall at any place during the spectrum, and they might use substances and not others. Reducing or stopping the use of one substance is a really valuable goal. It doesn't have to be all of them. And I don't know, just kind of normalizing that people use drugs, and we only stigmatize certain groups really heavily, right? And I think second is people can and do make rational decisions. When we work in harm reduction, the emphasis is not on abstinence, but the reduction of risk. We need to be non-judgmental. And these are the 8 principles from National Harm Reduction Coalition. And I'm kind of breezing through because I think folks probably have heard them. So it requires a non-judgmental approach because like we talked about before, shame and stigma prevent people from getting help. And really importantly, and we'll talk about some strategies for this later, is folks that you're working with need to have real influence and voice in kind of like their care and also in your programming. So thinking about, am I getting feedback from folks and am I operationalizing that or not? Because in order to be practicing harm reduction, you need to include the people who are experiencing the problem, right? In a way that has power. And then lastly, that there are many social inequities. We've kind of touched on that at length, that impact people and their substance use. And so harm reduction can look like the typical things we think about, like syringe service programs, overdose prevention sites, fentanyl test strips, naloxone kits and training, sterile equipment, but it also, again, and this is from Sam again. I mean, when I was looking for content, he kept coming up and he was getting it right. So, harm reduction can also look like that community that Sam was talking about, right? Or basic needs services. So it can mean so much more than just the typical interventions that we think about. And so I linked the full speech here if you want to read his full speech. This was from the International Harm Reduction Conference. But it was just speaking to all of the whole person services that they provide and the community building that they do, and how that is just as much harm reduction as the interventions we think of are, because communicating care reduces harm. Okay. So I know that was a lot. And since this is a 3-hour training, I built in a 5-minute break for folks to get up. If you have to use the restroom, if you get some water, I'm gonna get my coffee. And then, so we'll come back at 10:45 and I will turn it over to Kimber from Safe Spot to talk about one of the resources that folks that you transition to housing, actually really anyone can use, but in this context of this program, thinking about it, utilizing it that way. All right, so thanks everyone. I will see you in 5. Okay. Let's give everyone a minute or so to come on back. And I'm going to turn it over to Kimber King from Safe Spot. I think it's actually Harm Reduction Hotline. So I got that wrong when I did this slide, but she is going to tell you a little bit about her program and how you can use the resource to support folks that you're working with. So thank you so much for being here today, Kimber. I'm so happy to have you, and I will turn it over to you.
Awesome. Yeah, no, you got it right in that slide. It's overdose
Okay.
prevention hotline. Hi, everybody. Like Teresa said, I'm Kimber King. I'm the operations coordinator at SafeSpot. Just a little bit about me before I kind of get into the line and how it works and how this relates to you. I was a person who used IV heroin, fentanyl, cocaine for many, many years. And you know, when I was using, I kept going to rehab and trying to get clean, and it just didn't work for a long time. And I got kicked out of a program one day, and my local needle exchange, I went there to pick up some supplies when they kicked me out, and they gave me a card for Never Use Alone, which is a national line that does the same thing we do. We do the same thing nationally as well, but I called the line because I lived alone and I didn't want my family to know I had been kicked out of rehab. So I called and I used on the phone with an operator, and I ended up overdosing. And they got paramedics to me in time, and it saved my life. And so as years went by, I got sober and abstinent. I'm in abstinence-based recovery now. And
So I'm gonna go after.
Yeah. And so the paramedic that showed up at my house, Stephen Murray, he started this hotline, Safe Spot, and asked me if I wanted to work for the hotline. So I did. So I've been here since I started as a volunteer in 2023, I want to say, and became I got hired as a paid employee in October of 2023 after doing this as a volunteer. So I know that this works because it worked for me, and it got me to a place in my life where if I didn't have this and if this didn't keep me alive, I wouldn't be here to have the life I have today. So I really believe in this, and I know it can work for other people. So a little bit about what SafeSpot is. So we are a national hotline. We have operators on the phone 24/7, 365. Our hold times are about 10 to 14 seconds, depending. It's never above that. We don't leave people sitting and waiting on the phone when they're wanting to use. Obviously, I know personally, like when you're in that moment and you want to get high, you don't want to sit around waiting for someone. It feels silly. So we get people connected with an operator pretty fast. So we are this presentation was amazing, and I like to think of harm reduction, and I see that a lot of people work in like different programs that are here in this meeting, and harm reduction is just like another part of the continuum of care, right? Whether people want to end up getting sober or not, the harm reduction gives them the opportunity to maybe get there someday. So even if, this is against your beliefs, you believe in abstinence-based recovery, this can just be a piece of that for somebody to keep them alive long enough to get there. If that is kind of a barrier for you, and I know that is for a lot of people. So what happens when somebody uses us? I want to start seeing are our cards being put in with the naloxone kits. Like we've talked about, the rate of fatal overdoses has gone down in the country, and that's because we've done this great job of saturating the market with naloxone. But SafeSpot is kind of something that can stand in place when a person does not have anybody to push the plunger. because naloxone only works if there's 2 people, right? So I want to see these cards with the number being put out with every naloxone kit that goes out. So somebody calls the line, they hear an automatic, like a pre-recorded thing. You can sit and listen to that. It's my voice when it gets there. You can listen to that for the full intro. If you don't know how this line works and you want to hear a little bit more, you can listen to the full recording. If not, you hit 1, you get connected immediately to a supporter. All the supporters on our line are people with lived or living experience. So when somebody gets an operator, we want them to feel super comfortable. The people that they're going to talk to know what it feels like. There's not going to be any judgment. There's not going to be any stigma. There's not going to be any of those things. A lot of our operators were callers that started to work for us. We really pride ourselves in being a harm reduction friendly workplace. Abstinence is not a requirement to work for SafeSpot. I really believe that giving people some community and giving them some responsibility really helps people get out of some dark times in their life. Really makes them feel like they have something to look forward to. So we have a lot of overlap of all callers and operators. If an operator is picking up the phone, we know the people that work for us know they cannot be under the influence if they're answering calls. So we want to make sure that we're being present for people when we're on the phone with them. But they're going to get somebody that can connect with them is the point. So they'll get connected with a supporter, and if it's a first time caller, first time someone's calling, the most important part of our call is like a safety plan procedure, we call it. This should take only 2 to 3 minutes. We get it done really quickly. So we're getting a name, we're getting location. So we're getting really accurate location details. So we'll get the address, we put it in Google Maps, and when we get a visual on the building, so we're checking if this is an apartment building, is this a single family dwelling? If it's an apartment, what floor are you going to be on? Is there a door code to get into the building? Is there a code on your door to get into your apartment? All of that stuff. We're getting down to like, what room of the house are you going to be hanging out in? We have people that call that live with their families, but their families obviously don't know that you're using in the other room, or maybe they do, they just can't keep an eye on them in that moment. So we'll get all that information. We do it really quickly. Then the most important things we're asking for is what kind of drugs are you going to be using on the phone with us, and how are you going to be doing them? No matter what substance someone is using, we're going off fentanyl protocols. So what would happen if this drug was contaminated with fentanyl? And we call them kind of like safety timers. So we know how quickly someone could overdose or stop responding based on how they're doing the drug. So it doesn't even really matter what drug they're doing, is how are they going to be doing it, and how long would it take for fentanyl to render them unconscious. So once we get all that information, we give them some directions to kind of prep their space in case there was an emergency. Is there anybody in the house? Are there any pets in the house? If there's a dog, that needs to be put behind a door, so no one's dogs are getting shot at. The dogs aren't attacking first responders, that kind of thing. If they can put away any extra substances or paraphernalia that they might have, put those away. So if someone's coming into their space, they're not taking that extra stuff with them when they're leaving. And also we're asking people to unlock their front door. And that's just so we're preventing any kind of so people can get in there really quickly, and there's not going to be any kind of property damage in that kind of process. And then we love to give people the autonomy to choose who their emergency responder is going to be. Most people do select 911 to be the first call or be the only call, because people that are calling us tend to be people that are usually housed. Even though people do not have to have an address to use with us, we can find people if they're hiding in a bush. We can find people if they're hiding under a bridge. We'll find you. But most callers are housed that use us. So if they have a neighbor nearby that can come and give naloxone pretty easily, we can take the person's phone number, get somebody there, so we can kind of get over that boundary of like, they don't want law enforcement coming, because we can't control who's going to show up on the scene. So we like to give people the autonomy of like, what's your safety plan gonna be in this call? And that can change too over time. People trust us more, that kind of thing. So once we have all that information, you know, we tell them, okay, do your shot, do your line, do whatever you're doing. Just let us know when you finish. Our operators start timers. We different times for different reasons. Things that have rang tried and true for us. It's, you know, we're the first people to be doing this, so it really has just come with doing this over time, learning what kind of things work best. And another thing I like to mention too is that we do not store anybody's address or name or we don't collect demographics. None of that stuff is going into any kind of database. All of our operators have notebooks at home that, with caller's permission, we can write down their address. That way, if they use us a second time, instead of having to go through the prolonged safety plan, we can just be like, oh yeah, you're so-and-so, are you still at this address? Is this still your safety plan? Okay, cool. So yeah, and then most of our calls are us just kind of hanging out with people on the phone. We're just making conversation, keeping people talking to keep them alert. If people start talking in cursive and they're really just going into a heavy nod, like we just need some verbal confirmation that you're still there. Some people, 30% of our callers are stimulant only callers. So people are calling injecting just cocaine or just smoking crack. So sometimes people don't want to talk, like it freaks them out. So we kind of like gauge and ask, you know, what kind of call would you like? You know, would you like us to just kind of check in every single minute, or would you like us to like make conversation? So whatever is comfortable for that person. So yeah, that's kind of what we do. And then once everything is okay, you know, we say, all right, your safety timer's up. If people can dose again if they want to, or they can hang up and just go about their day. If we have a situation where somebody stops responding, we have a national 911 service we use. We give them the address and we get connected to the closest dispatch within like seconds. And so we've had 22 people that we've had to call on in the past almost 3 years now. It happens very rarely because we get this unique opportunity to kind of slow people down on the phone. There's a lot of overdoses that we've actually, you know, stopped from happening because we can hear that people are not responding as well anymore. We can hear it in their voice. And we can kind of be like, all right, well, you know, you want to take another shot, but you're sounding kind of like slurry. You know, if you want to, you know, how about we just talk for a few minutes? And people are free to do whatever they want. They can just be like, you know what, screw yourself. I'm doing whatever I want to do. I'm not in the business of telling people what to do. But I'm here to just keep people safe. So yeah, that's a little bit about the hotline and what we do. I want to talk a bit about how this can kind of help people get into stabilized housing and stay there. So one thing with SafeSpot is not everybody is using in supervised spaces. And we know that the biggest risk of overdosing and fatal overdoses using alone. So this is just like a really low barrier, confidential thing. And we're not going to push anybody towards any kind of recovery or anything like that. That's just not what we're here to do. We're here to just spot people. But it gives people a place to kind of be themselves. And, you know, we see people's lives change in some ways bigger than others. So I saw from the comments too that, you know, a lot of people in here are coming from a lot of different programs. And so one of the things that I wanted to mention is when people are coming into your programs, and you know, I know that a lot of different programs kind of have different rules about like bathroom monitoring, you know, knowing people locking the door, you know, people are not able to, you know, you're just scared that people are going to overdose in the bathroom. We've had people in different kinds of programs overdose in these spaces. So this safe spot can be a way for maybe to, you know, kind of lessen the burden on the staff of monitoring bathrooms 24/7. You know, you put some safe spot cards in the bathroom. People can call us on their cell phone while they're using in there. We're always happy if we know that we're working with a program. If they tell us, hey, I'm in, you know, this needle exchange, I'm in this methadone clinic, and we're working with that program. And if something happens, instead of calling 911, if we have like a plan worked out with this place, we can call the front desk, be like, hey, we have someone in the bathroom that has stopped responding, and then we can send people to go check on them. So that way we're getting people help, or we could call 911, but we're getting people help before you find out that you have someone dead in your bathroom. Another thing too, about some of the low barrier housing and everything that's starting to go up, which is awesome. People are coming out of situations where they've been on the streets for a really long time. And what we've learned doing this work is when people are using on the streets, they're using in community, right? So there is always someone there. If something wrong happens, usually they can get help. So when people are going into these situations where they get new apartments, all these things, we're seeing deaths increase because they didn't have, they're so used to having someone there. So Safe Spot is really just like a program that can step in these situations. We worked with some other low threshold housing programs. We have fridge magnets that you can put into units before people move in. You know, it goes on the refrigerator. It could just be something that always comes with a new apartment. So whoever lives there has this information. And a big problem too is, you know, people are at risk for losing their housing when there's an overdose. So like I said before about people, you know, being able to choose a neighbor or someone to respond in the case of an overdose, you know, this could kind of cut down on, you know, people's, the fatal overdoses, just for people not having to feel so like everything is at risk, so I have to use alone. That, you know, we never want that either. I liked earlier, I wrote some notes down when people were talking. Everybody was having these conversations about, you know, building trust with different participants in their programs, different clients. And I loved the conversation that was like happening about that. And I kind of just had like a little response to that. I think the more we're having these conversations with people, people that use drugs are so used to having to hide everything about their lives. They're not showing up at appointments because they're high and they can't tell you that they're high, that kind of thing. And I think maybe it's good to remember sometimes, like sometimes people just aren't ready. If there's somebody that's, you know, not showing that they're participating and there's in this plan that you're making with them and stuff, maybe people just aren't ready. But also, the more that we're having these conversations with people that, you know, you are a safe person, if they're using, like if they can tell you without having to see any kind of negative consequences, like, you know, people have kids, and if they are honest with you and they're missing their appointments because they can't be honest with you, you know, they're going to lose their kids, they're going to lose their housing. But the more that we can like create these spaces where we can kind of just kind of meet people where they are in that moment, and the more of a good like culture that's going to create of, okay, I know that I can tell this person what's really going on, and you know, there isn't going to be my services aren't going to be withheld, all of these things. I think that was just great that people were talking about that. That was awesome. And helping residents stay housed. This safe spot can be a great way to keep people from dying, like I said, in their apartments, and seeing like the turnover in the low threshold housing, all these things. The longer we can keep people like safe, the less that, you know, people are going to be losing housing, dying in housing, all of these things. But yeah, I feel like I'm forgetting some things. Let me see here. Oh yeah, and I'd like to add that a lot of calls that we get at Safe Spot are people like you folks that work at programs that have questions. We love getting calls just asking for more information. You know, if you could even call and pretend you're using, if you really just want to see how it works, if you're curious, or you know, you're hesitant to refer somebody, just we don't mind. We secret shop other hotlines all the time to see what's happening and seeing how people are actually treated. But another thing that we really, really encourage is if you know somebody that could use us, if somebody has a boyfriend and they live together and the boyfriend ends up, they end up breaking up, the partner ends up in jail, the partner ends up in rehab, this person is used to using in community all the time with their partner, right? And then all of a sudden this partner's gone. We see this on the line over and over. People end up using alone because they're so used to somebody being there, and for the first time they're not, and then they pass away. So those are some great times to like realize like, yeah, this is obviously a high risk situation for this person. They're just getting out of jail, that kind of thing. Those are great times to kind of refer us as a resource outside of housing as well. And we love doing it like test run calls is what we call them. So if you have somebody that that could use the service, if you dial up the number in front of them, you guys sit there on speakerphone and you're like, "Hi, this is Teresa from, so. I have a friend here with me. I would love if you could just like explain a little bit about the hotline, how it works." And then they could ask us some questions. We do this all the time. It's very, very difficult for people to make that first phone call because if you hear about this and you don't have this presentation to hear how this works and see what it does, like you're like, okay, there has to be some catch. This is like a police hotline. You think it's going to be very clinical. It's really not. It's all the people that work for us. They're very laid back. We try to keep this like just a very safe space, like the name says, for people. But it's hard to make that first call. So if you can do that with somebody and show them there is going to be a friendly voice on the other end and, somebody that's there to like laugh and make jokes with them, I think that goes a long way. So yeah, I think I've kind of hit on everything. If anybody has any questions, I'd love to answer some questions or yeah.
Thank you so much, Kimber. I love hearing about the resource and also like you weaved in everything we've been talking about in this presentation and kind of saying like, well, these are the things that make this resource accessible and something that people want to use and work because it's a safe space. It's a space where people aren't going to be judged and they're going to be cared for. And also able to direct how they're cared for, which I think is really important. We did have some questions in the chat. One was about materials. I know you and I had a conversation about how we might want to do that, so I'll turn that over to you. And the other one is, where is this available? Is it just Massachusetts?
Okay, yeah. So we are a Massachusetts-based program because Massachusetts has been footing the entire bill for us for 3 years. We've always taken calls nationally. We still do. 98% of our calls actually come from outside of Massachusetts. So we're really trying to figure out how to get Massachusetts callers to come in a little bit more. We have been serving Canada for the past 3 years too, but we just stopped doing that just because Canada has their own line like this and they have like 4 times the funding to keep it going, so they can handle it. But yeah, it's everywhere. Where we've gotten funding in Maine and Connecticut right now, so we'll be doing that. Just means we're going to be hiring from those states. We're really turning this into like a harm reduction workforce as well, so we'll be marketing and hiring in those states. Vermont, we had some funding and it got messed up with everything that's going on, so we're pivoting and trying to figure out something else. But yeah, no, everyone everywhere can use it in the United States. We had a caller from Puerto Rico for a while. That was really cool because we did some digging and we found out that there's only one ambulance station for the whole of Puerto Rico.
Oh,
So
wow.
we could definitely get somebody there because there was only one number that we had to find. So we can also do that too, but I doubt anybody is going to be giving this to anyone in Puerto Rico, but who knows? But because all of our funding is in Massachusetts, all of our resources are on the Mass Clearinghouse for free. But if you don't have a Massachusetts address, you can't get those resources right now. We as a program can mail them out to you ourselves. So I'm gonna put my email in the chat. And if you want any cards or posters, we have those. And then for different programs that could use the fridge magnets, we can also send those out as well. And we also have, I think we have door knockers too, but don't quote me on that.
Awesome. Thank you. And Molly, do you have your hand up for a question?
I do, yeah. And they're two kind of very separate questions. Kimber, I'm wondering if you could share with us your understanding of the difference between safe spot and never use alone. And then my second question was originally going to be for Teresa, and then it actually could do nicely in here. So most of us are doing housing permanency support. So supporting people to get access to housing and then stay in independent housing. And I think it's an agency policy decision of what to do when you show up and somebody is very much visually intoxicated or seems to be nodding off. How long do you stay? How do you ensure that it feels like it's safe to leave, or when you would call the ambulance, which is never what you want to do. So sort of wondering if that would be an opportunity to call you all, but somebody wouldn't have been able to give you their pre-use plan before then. Yeah, those are my questions.
Sorry, I'm gonna start with the last one first. I already forgot the first. I wouldn't, if there's a situation where you found somebody and you don't know what's going on, I think the only reason why it wouldn't be your safest bet to call us is just because we would have no idea what substances this person took or any of that information. We would have an address and everything, but it would kind of be hard for us to gauge if that person isn't like responding enough to answer those questions. But if you walk up on somebody, this also really has to do a lot with how your comfortability with like giving naloxone and everything. So, let's say that you are somebody that has naloxone, you know how to give naloxone, you know how to do, safety, you know how to do recovery breaths, all of that kind of stuff. I think if you walk up on somebody, I mean, obviously, if they're blue, if you see any signs of their lips turning blue, that kind of thing, it's best to call. A lot of programs are switching over to keeping oxygen on site now because naloxone doesn't work for xylazine. And we're really seeing a lot of the people being, just out of it because of the xylazine over the fentanyl. But if you see someone's taking like 4 to 5 breaths a minute, if you can see their chest rising that much, that is enough that they're going to be okay. So kind of timing that is the most important thing. If it's kind of dipping under there, that would be the time to call.
The other thing some programs have using, which actually would work really well, I think, mobily, is pulse ox. There's a little bit of a challenge if someone's hands are really like calloused, damaged, also darker skin, doesn't work as well. But it is a tool in the toolbox that someone easily could take out and programs could easily buy, and you can kind of check on their oxygen levels, which is a good indicator about whether or not they're going to be okay. If their oxygen saturation is high and they're taking those breaths like Kimber mentioned, then it's just something else that gives you a little bit more information. I definitely think, there's such I'm trying to think of like over time how I kind of like developed my abilities and sense to like know what direction things are headed in. And I think like how difficult is it to get to someone to respond is also another indicator. If it's pretty difficult, but they're breathing, like, I don't know, I would stick around, I think, and sit with that person, or at least like, yeah, no, I would stick around with that person for a little bit.
Any verbal confirmation is you do not need to give naloxone.
Right.
If they are still answering, even if it's a grunt, even if it's a huh, anything, any verbal confirmation means you do not need to Narcan somebody.
Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, I think what we used to do in programs, which is a little more difficult when you're kind of going to people's homes, right? Is we would just make sure that they're in a space where we can see them and make sure that things don't change. And I mean, I don't think people were there for like hours and hours necessary. You know what I mean? I don't think like you can within probably 20, 30 minutes, I think you can get a sense and feel more comfortable about making a decision, but I think always just hanging out for a little bit is a good idea.
No, for sure. And I'm sorry, what were your other questions?
Yeah, thank you for that. That was a good conversation. Do you have a sense of any functional differences between safe spot and never use alone?
Oh yeah. I mean, so the biggest thing I would say is, I mean, even from my experience as being a caller from Never Use Alone, they have a very hard, it's not always a guarantee that you're going to get somebody that answers from Never Use Alone because, and a lot of it has to do with their turnover. Safe Spot became a fully, like, we pay everybody that works for us per call. You know, they get differentials, nights, evenings, weekends, all of that. You can't do this work and not pay somebody for it. It can be, it's mentally taxing. It's time you're taking out of your day, first off, but we get a lot of people that call a lot. We get to know people. We've lost people. And that's a lot to ask somebody to do. So Never Use Alone still is volunteer. They have a high turnover rate. It just fluctuates a lot with that. And I did the training for Never Use Alone to become an operator. I never ended up doing it because I had just gotten sober. It just wasn't working out for me at that time. And the trainings are a little bit scarce, but so we have like we have people do like almost 20 hours of didactic training and tests and quizzes, and we do test calls with people too. Like one of our operators loves like doing role play scenarios, and he puts our new operators like through their paces and just to make sure like they can call, like they're not panicking in the moment and can't call emergency services. So I would like to think that we do a really good job at training people. We have people that are ready to in those if a call goes south, and we pay people for doing the work. This is a job just like anything else, and yeah, so that's a big part of what's different. I think besides that, everything is pretty much the same. They don't take Canada either. I don't think they've ever taken calls from Canada. But it's pretty much the same service besides that.
Great, thank you.
And then we have one comment in the chat about, yes, so great thing to be attentive to. If they're not responding and you're hearing that like rattly breathing, that is a sign someone's in trouble. And depending on what resources you have, you might have to make different decisions. A lot of oxygen support is appropriate in that situation. And it makes me think, like, if I wanted to send folks out into the community, I would make sure that they had CPR masks that they were comfortable with. Because I know we're not lugging oxygen to people's homes, but there's so many different types of masks. And I think some people just like don't love doing mouth to mouth, but it's so important. And the oxygen support is so important that it's like, what tools can I give people to make that it is the most important thing. Like, what tools can I give people for them to feel more comfortable? And so some things that we've used, some people are fine with just the mask or pulling a shirt over and like whatever, just some kind of barrier. I don't know what kind of mode I go into it, but I'm just gonna do it. Like, I don't need anything necessarily. But some folks want those like thicker, they look like, like the ones that look like a cup that you might use in CPR training that are reusable and a little bit further away. And some people really want ambu bags, and that is an option. They're not horribly expensive, especially the masks that just give you a little bit of distance. So yeah, I think one thing I would think in that situation is like, what are we giving for people to have the tools that they need to feel comfortable responding? But yes, certainly if someone's not responding and you're really hearing like that gurgly breathing, you may need to administer naloxone. Any other questions for Kimber before we move on from this really amazing presentation? Thank you again so much for, I think this is such an important resource for when people are in housing, because I think we can't overstate that transition, right? Moving from community to being a little more isolated. I think the other thing that happens is like, and this is, part of the story of the person that I lost, is someone is, is successfully abstinent for a long time, but all that stigma and shame, if they have a return to use, like they hide it from other people because they're ashamed. And
Yeah,
yeah,
a
go
lot
ahead.
of people, so sorry. The
No,
lot
go. Yeah.
just thinking recently in this past year, besides, people that we've had through the line, but most of the people that we've lost in these past couple of years have been people that were in long-term recovery. So people that I work with in the harm reduction field, that I work in the public health field, because we want to make sure that we're supporting our supporters too. Because even though someone has 5 years, I've lost plenty of people that had 5 years, 8 years, 3 years,
Yep.
So even people that are coming into your programs and they're like, hey, I have 2 months, I have 6 months, it can happen still. So this is just always good to have in your safety plan. Do you have an naloxone? Do you have a safe spot card in case you don't have anybody there? Like it should just be like hand in hand now. And anybody that works in these programs too, people that are in long-term recovery, people that are in abstinence-based recovery, just know that like we're here to support you too. And this is totally confidential. We don't tell people who calls this line, and we've had plenty of people. Well, we've had a few. We're like hoping to have more, but we've seen people finally reaching out in this field that work in this field that have been, they haven't had anybody to tell, and they've used with us. So we're here for everybody.
Yeah. Thank you for saying that, because I think that's such a big piece. And you're getting shout outs in the chat too for your amazing work. So yeah, again, so grateful that you were able to come and present today and talk about this resource. And I hope that you all follow up and get some fridge magnets from Kimber for your folks. So thank you.
Thank you.
All right. And actually, like this conversation again, and I feel like it's just going this way with this training, which is really nice, is a great segue for us to start talking about some of the strategies. And we touched on some of them already. And specifically talking about that safety planning, which we will get to. And so just to start quickly, because I talked too much in the beginning and, I'm always racing to the finish of these trainings. What are some ways that you have seen substance use impact people's tenancy, if you have? And you can drop it in the chat. You can come off mute. You can do whatever you're comfortable with. I know earlier we talked about one of the challenges is engagement, right? And that could affect tenancy if like, they're not calling on you as a support when they need you. That's one way. Police visits, a really great thing potentially about Safe Spot. If they can identify someone else, they might be able to reduce first responder traffic to their home when appropriate. Eviction, non-payment, neighbors concerned or
Um,
frustrated.
Sometimes the stigmatization just gets people on a bad, alignment with their property manager because
Yep.
they're, they just don't like the fact that that's what's going on there, and
Yeah.
it's not objectively really that meaningful. So I've just seen that a lot.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Like reluctance to rent to certain folks or I don't want to say targeted, but like, yeah, exactly what you said. Just kind of having this preconceived notion about how it's going to go based on substance
But
use.
even beyond just like giving them an opportunity, once they're there, like learning that, they just start watching the camera. They're like watching that person, so yeah.
Yep. I don't know why, but I was like, I wasn't going to say they get targeted, but like they do. Like people get watched more closely and a lot more attention to what's going on privately when they know that information up front versus the many, many people who are using substances inside, but maybe someone doesn't know about it. Failed
Gonna say
inspections. Oh, go ahead.
targeting big time. Folks, if folks definitely get targeted, and then they feel like they can't have guests over because every time a guest comes over, they're assuming that there's either dealing or buying going on. And yeah, it can be really tough for
Yeah.
folks when they first move in to have that target so
Yeah.
strongly on their back.
Right. On top of everything else that they're trying to manage during the transition. It's a lot. And I think, we talked about guests in one of the other trainings because we talked about people losing their community and sometimes that guilt about moving into an apartment when someone else couldn't and allowing guests. And so like there's work to do around that with folks. Yeah, drug paraphernalia. I'd also like to say, alcohol paraphernalia is actually like the bigger one that I've seen as a challenge. And sometimes just smoking anything, right? And what the neighbors think about that, whether or not it's allowed. Yeah, not being able to pay rent. Yeah, so there's a number of ways, and I think you touched on every single one. Except for maybe that behavioral health symptoms also sometimes can be exacerbated depending on what the person is struggling with and depending on what they're using either to self-medicate, which sometimes can like long term make symptoms a little worse and make the challenges they face a little bit worse. But these are all things that we can work with, right? And so I think organizationally, there are some strategies we can think about, and you might be able to achieve these through partnership. You might be able to have resources in-house. I left a little bit of the stuff in here about things we might do in shelter or more congregate spaces, because I know you all are working with people like during the full transition from like unhoused to housed. So I think making naloxone and safer use materials, test strips, especially educating people that test strips are not just for confirmation of fentanyl when you think you're getting fentanyl. It's really for those situations like where stimulant users are wanting to know what might be in their substances, being concerned that it might have fentanyl in it when that's not what they intended to use. So as widely available as you can make those things, or as widely available as you can disseminate resources and ways to get things for those folks, really important. And just remembering that your participants and the people you're working with are the most likely to save someone's life. So getting these things in their hands is so critical. That's that naloxone saturation we were talking about. So important to have that for people using drugs, important to have that for anyone who's going to be working with people who are using drugs. Looking at your policies and procedures to reduce barriers to drug users trying to access shelter and housing. So some sites have no questions asked lockers, or they'll hold people's supplies in a locked area. A shelter that I operated, a warming center, that's what we did. We just kind of had no questions asked bags, and they were behind a desk, and you could come and go with them, but they didn't get on like the floor. Reducing or eliminating drug use related service suspensions, no restrictions on coming and going. People have to inject frequently with fentanyl, and that's something that can prevent someone from coming inside if there's restrictions. And again, I know these all come with like logistical challenges, but it's definitely some things to think about. And then I would say like making sure that people have safe spot or never use alone type resources available to them, regardless of where they are. Providing services independent of whether or not a person uses substances sounds like that's really not a concern for this group. I know, like we talked about, when someone can't participate in the conversation, but there are circumstances that I have seen where people will say, you can't be here if you're under the influence, or you can't continue to work with me if you don't stop using drugs. And that's like the opposite of harm reduction. That's kind of withholding services that people need because they're experiencing the problem that they need the services for. It's a little counterintuitive. And certainly as agencies, you're going to want to think about what your overdose response protocols are. You want to train. And I think even when I think about this service, you could if you're trained in naloxone administration and protocols, right? Like you can pass that information along to someone that might need it, whether it's the person you're working with or maybe it's their natural support. So having those conversations, and then in congregate spaces, this won't really necessarily work in once someone is housed, but thinking about if there's reverse motion detection, what is your bathroom protocol? Do you have a check protocol? where I previously worked, we had one where it just, like kind of Kimber said on the line, it was just, we just need verbal confirmation that you're okay. And that was it. That was enough for us. But also building strong connections with your harm reduction programs locally to help you connect to some of these resources. Making sure that you're supporting people and creating community. Again, we heard in that video that that is harm reduction, that helps people heal, whatever their goals in that area may be. And then that would include culturally specific or holistic healing practices, connecting things to people that feel relevant to them culturally and personally. And then in congregate spaces, we talked about this is like, can you build safe spaces for people to rest or de-escalate? So I know in a clinic in BMC, they have where it's called the Start Clinic. This is in Massachusetts. It's just an example. People sometimes come in having used a little more stimulants than they intended to, and I think we kind of all know what that looks like. And so they have kind of like space where people can be separate. It's quiet and it's kind of like less stimulating and helps people get back into a better headspace, so that they can continue to participate in programming. So just some things to think about. The other thing that we had in some of the shelters is like we would have, if we had a lot of people in that day and someone was really oversedated, we might have like an area where it's really easy to see folks. And it's not a punishment, it's not a service restriction. It's like, I just need to be able to see you for a little bit until you're looking a little bit better, like someone we're concerned about. And so thinking about building that in, and again, some of this is a little more for like your pre-tenancy stage of working with people than it will be for in tenancy. And so the other thing that we already kind of touched on and started talking about is for assessment and safety planning, like those are two big tools when it comes to harm reduction and working with folks, especially safety planning around using substances and kind of exactly what Kimber was talking about, because you can build that into your safety plan already, right? Like it doesn't have to just be their safety plan for when they access hotline services. It can be their safety plan generally. And so I guess my question to the group is, what information might you want to know if someone's using substances to help develop a comprehensive safety plan?
I really liked Kimber's list
Yep.
of things she talked through. That just felt thorough and caring, not digging.
Yeah, absolutely. And so just to remind folks is, what are you using? What's the route of administration? And then it's like, who would you want to know? And so, if they're not using a hotline, like, is there some communication they can have with a family member or a neighbor? Like, hey, can you check on me at this time, X time, 5 minutes? Can you call me in 5 minutes if I don't respond? And that's, that has to be people that they're comfortable disclosing their use to, but people have those people in their lives. And other little things like leaving the door open, keeping naloxone, like you can't use naloxone on yourself, right? But keeping it around so it's visible. So if someone can get through your door, they should be able to see it and easily administer it. Making a plan for what should happen if you all can't get in contact with the person. And then talking about, is there anyone in your life that you could let know about what you're going through and ask for support or to check on you, like we talked about. And so other things to consider when you are working with folks and getting to know them is the promotion of these overdose prevention lines, kind of assessing for substance use's impact on a person's well-being, and also maybe if there's a history there with tenancy, learning more about that, because part of our harm reduction, right, is keeping people in their homes. Assessing for stages of change so that we're making sure we're aligned with our interventions. We're not trying to do something that doesn't feel like the person isn't valuing that intervention at that time, or they're not ready to make that change at that time. That will kind of like cause a little bit of a rift. talk about what might cause a person to increase or decrease use, and talk about that in your assessment and your safety planning, right? Because some people might be using or drinking kind of just to maintain, but certain events, triggers, reminders, anniversaries might come up and you might see an increase or decrease. And it's helpful to know that. And it's helpful to have that conversation are kind of focused around like what support do you think you need when that happens, or like how can we work proactively to make sure that you're safe as these things come up. And then also like how does it look like when you're well versus not well. And I will say that in order to do any of this, you still have to keep that like spirit of harm reduction with you, because you probably can't expect people to necessarily even disclose all of this if you don't communicate the non-judgment, and that it's these conversations are not tied to my like evaluation of your worth as a human. Like that is just that is there no matter what. But we want to talk about this because it impacts you and because it'll help me support you. And I think one good example, we were working on a team for another project, and they had the conversation about what does it look like when you're well, when you're not well. A person had returned to use after some period of abstinence, and so they were at increased risk, but they were terrified to disclose. And so they kind of use that, said like, I'm noticing this, you told me this is what you looked like. And it opened that door because that person was able to have that conversation in a kind and caring and not judgmental way. It opened the door for the person to say like, yes, I need some more support, or like you should just be aware this is happening. And so then you can have those conversations about safety. Another strategy, I think, to ensure we are maintaining like fidelity to a harm reduction approach is assessing as organizations how we're involving people with lived and living experience. So advisory boards is a lot of like people do that frequently. And I think the one thing I'll say about that is if you're going to do an advisory board, like you have to actually give like real decision making power. Like you can't just have this advisory board and if they're all telling you the same thing as an agency, kind of to be like, well, yeah, that's just the advisory board's opinion. It has to be some way of facilitating like that transfer of power, that restoration of power, and have those discussions and really kind of integrating it into the governance or like the direction of the agency. Also, if you're going to do that, or if you're going to use people to make decisions about your agency, plan, evaluate, make sure they're being compensated. Certainly always provide training. Like I said, people that we're working with are the most likely, right, to respond to an overdose. So we want to make sure everyone has that training and that ability and the resources that they need. And then capacity building is more among staff. And I think there are a lot of great train the trainer programs out there for people who are interested, just to make sure that you can give this training, like overdose prevention training, frequently enough so that everyone knows how to respond. And create inclusive and respectful spaces, co-develop policies and programs. That's kind of part of that governance piece. Use peer-led models, or make sure you have a peer workforce, and make sure there are feedback loops that people feel like they can really use. I think one of the most frequent things that I have heard over my time doing this is, yeah, they do a survey, but like they don't ever do anything about it. Or, yeah, I give my feedback, or I don't give my feedback anymore because they don't do anything about it. So I think being accountable to people is something that is really important that sometimes we overlook, right? So we want to say, here's the survey, this is the information that I got, and then this is what I'm going to do about it, versus, okay, we have the information, but we can't operationalize any change. So one, like make sure you're getting feedback on something you can actually shift if it's needed, and then give that information back to folks. And this can be done in people's housing, supported housing too, right? Like there's all kinds of mechanisms for doing that. And that could be surveys that you give regularly. It could be some agencies do like QA calls. a totally different person from their provider to, you know, ensure a little bit of confidentiality. And also, like, you know, there's a dynamic. If you're asking for feedback, you have to make sure the relationship is there for them to be comfortable to give you that. And they may never be comfortable giving you that, depending on your dynamic, but also just depending on who they are as a person. It can be hard for people to give feedback, especially if they've been. Especially if it hasn't been well received in the past, I guess is what I will say. And so part of harm reduction, you saw in the principles that we talked about quite a little bit of time ago now, that lived experience is critical, because also the other thing is people know what they need, right? Oh, and yep, Molly just put a capacity building opportunity in naloxone training from the state. So definitely take advantage of that resource. Just some general tips. These are probably things that you've already heard, so I didn't do an extensive for this purpose, because I feel like this is more of like a 201 for folks than 101, but these are kind of like the 101 tips you can use to start having conversations with people about how they're using drugs. So first and foremost, start low, go slow. I think you heard Kimbra talk about like, oh, we have these conversations and we can use those to assess where people are at, and people can make more like thoughtful decisions about their substance use. And sometimes the setting where people are prevents this from being able to happen, right? If they're outside, if they're in a public restroom, they don't get to go slow. They have to go quickly. They have to get it done and get out of there, or they're probably going to get some attention on them. When they're housing, you can have that conversation about like, you can always take more, but you can't take less. So like, what does that look like? Know the risks of combining substances. Like a lot of people are combining substances. That's reality. Also kind of explaining the risks of the drug supply, right? So we talked about how there's a lot of adulterants, lots of things are kind of getting a little bit cross-pollinated, and people might not exactly be always aware of what they're taking, and sometimes they are. Sometimes it's people's substance of choice to combine substances. And so I think just being able to give the information, and at the bottom of this list, I linked harm reduction, safer drug use. I would encourage you to check that out and it will give you kind of the ability to have more extensive conversations about the risks of mixing certain substances, what might happen, even safer injecting practices. Sterile supplies, I'm sure you all know. Knowing that different routes of administration have different effects. There's been quite a bit of movement nationally from injecting substances to smoking substances. You know, I haven't done enough research to know like why people think this is happening. I mean, I think it could be that there's a lot less like risk of damage to like your veins and less risk of infection if you're smoking something. It's not completely eliminated, right? But there's less risk of disease transmission smoking versus injecting. But there's also differences in how the drug impacts you or how quickly, right? And people should be educated about that so they can make an informed choice. And maybe that's your first harm reduction intervention, right? If someone is saying like, I can't even find a vein anymore, I've done so much damage, being able to have the conversation about different routes of administration if they're not going to not use substances, right? What the options are and what it might be like for them so they can make a decision about what to try. And again, like it is risk reduction. It's just it's a different way of doing it that comes with different challenges, but sometimes less risks. And making sure they have sterile supplies for the route of administration that they prefer. A lot, I'm not going to say all, but a lot of syringe service programs now do offer safer smoking equipment. And so yeah, being able to point them in the direction of that resource, what does that look like? As well as other routes of administration equipment for using safely, no matter what their choice is going to be. trying not to use alone. This is probably the biggest challenge you all are going to face when people are going to supported housing, right? People are going from that community to isolation, like we've talked about. And so, like, who can they count on to support them? Can they invite someone over? Can be tricky. People, like, the complexities of that have come up, right? People feel reluctant to have people over. They don't want to be targeted by their landlord. And so it's like weighing those risks and benefits and pros and cons. And I think there's just like a lot of power in even just having that conversation and approaching that conversation. Because it communicates that you understand reality of what this person is experiencing. It also communicates that you care about their well-being more than you care about whether or not they're using drugs. That's really important. And then always like carry naloxone. I call mine my emotional support naloxone because the only time I didn't have it, which I was in Greece, like that's when I didn't have it and needed it. And so I always carry it no matter what. Like I just feel like you never know. And I'd rather be prepared to respond than not prepared. And then I think the other thing that I didn't put on the slide, but I do want to talk about is as you're training and being prepared to administer naloxone, people have a lot of different responses in emergencies. And I can definitely distinctly remember supervising some staff who like froze, and that's a trauma response. An overdose can be scary if you haven't seen it more than once, right? And so I think learning that about yourself and your staff is really important, and it's something that you can start talking about and working on, like in supervision, if that's a challenge. Sometimes it's just the first time is just really scary, and talking about that. But also like, how are you approaching this as a team? How are you supporting each other? And the feelings that come up if things don't go the way that you had wished they had gone when you're responding. I don't know. I just think like processing that and understanding that is critical in moving through your ability to respond effectively. And just saying that from having supervised folks coming in at all levels of experience with responding to overdoses and kind of watching their process and growth. And I think part of that process and growth was being able to reflect. And as supervisors, that some folks are on this call are supervisors, also taking a non-judgmental approach when people experience trauma responses and kind of like helping them work through that. And sometimes the shame that's attached to that. I know I had some folks that felt really awful that they froze. And we talked about normalizing it and what we could do to make it less scary next time and what we could do to support their growth in that regard. Oops. Okay. And I'm also, so we talked about some of the basic tips. This will go into a little bit more of advanced tips, but it's more talking about a framework for how you're thinking about interventions. And so, we want to approach harm reduction from a place of empowering people, supporting their autonomy. And so one of the ways and frameworks that's out there to do that is good, better, best. And then there's also avoid, but it's not in the name of the framework. So that entails giving all of the information about a choice that a person might be making, right? And helping them make the best decision that they can with the resources they have available at the time, right? So we're giving all the information. We're also acknowledging the reality of people's circumstances sometimes. Again, I'm thinking about when you all are working kind of with folks pre-tenancy and what those circumstances might be, whether they're in shelter, whether they're outside, whether they're couch surfing, whatever those circumstances are, their resources are going to be different, right? And again, not judging when we give this information, right? So here is an example. So we often talk about never trying to not use alone, but really like the best option is using with someone you trust, especially in Vermont where there's been this increase of xylazine. Folks might be sedated for quite some time. So you want to have that conversation with them about like who are safe people that you use with and maybe who are some people that you're not sure if you trust or you wouldn't only want to use with them, or maybe you've had some experiences with them in the past where their behavior, you know, it was off and you don't really trust them to take care of you. So that's probably best. Take turns as having best, and best practice is having naloxone or oxygen, right? Now better is using like an app or a hotline. I mean, I think that could be better or best given the circumstances, right? But certainly keeping doors unlocked. If you can let someone know, let someone know. And again, start low, go slow. And so that would be a circumstance where they oh, I just gotta, okay, examples of apps. I do have some examples of apps. So one unfortunate thing that happened, I believe recently, is I think they're sunsetting the Brave app, the free Brave app that people were using. So I believe you can still, as providers, get licenses for that and like as a tool if you were interested. But my understanding is the free version is going away, which sucks, honestly. It's too bad. I'm not sure what the organizational changes that are leading to that are. But the other app that folks sometimes use is called Canary, and it's literally like it's a little yellow bird. It's yellow with the white bird, but that's what a canary is, and it's similar to the hotline, so never use alone or a safe spot. I mean, I think my preference is always for the hotlines for a live person. You know you have someone on the line versus the app. I think you're like waiting a little bit, but certainly an option because people have different preferences and are comfortable with different things. And then, so kind of moving on to like good is if you have to use by yourself, maybe go to a public place. And that's like a tricky one, right? Because it also puts a little bit of a target on your back. But again, it's like have that discussion about preferences and pros and cons and resources. If that's their only option, have that discussion, right? So if you're going to be like, say, I always think about public restrooms. So don't lock the door, I think would be a tip. If you can do that, see if you can have someone that checks on you, or maybe use the hotline or app while we're in public. Have Narcan visible. Again, so that concept of like you can't use naloxone on yourself, but if I were to come in and I noticed that you were kind of on the floor in the restroom, if your Narcan is like in your pocket or somewhere like you take it out right before you use, right? I see it, I have it, I can respond. And again, same thing, like try to go lower and slower if you don't have anyone there to support you or you're not speaking with anyone that can support you. And then avoid is like try not to use in total isolation, which I have mixed feelings about saying that because sometimes it's just the reality, right? I think someone could always call a hotline. I worry that people sometimes are like so ashamed that they won't use any resource. And so giving them all those resources and trying to do the work to reduce the shame, I think is a really important tool. And then of course, like talking to people about their risk moving into housing from community. Maybe you don't use as much as you did when you were in community. If they've had a period of abstinence, I think talking about that up front, like if they're amid their period of abstinence, like kind of discussing what the risks look like should return to use happen and like what's our plan. And we can talk about this now. And if you can present that in a way that reduces like shame and kind of fear of asking for help, that can be pretty critical for when people struggle because it's like, Kimber also said, people go years and then struggle, and we don't want to be in a position where they're afraid to tell us that they need help. Okay. Just one more example. Actually, I think I have two more examples. When we talk about sterile water, when we're talking about injecting, so best is new sterile or saline. Sorry, I've been talking so much, I'm like, can't now. Bottled water is better. Good is tap water. That can come with some stuff. It's not always super sterile. Or water from the back of a toilet, and avoid groundwater or water from the front of the toilet. And you might be thinking, like, who would do that? But I think when you are in withdrawal and you're really sick and say you're living outside, maybe you have service restrictions, you really like can't go in a lot of places, that becomes a reality for people. And so I just think like educating people about all the different options and maybe some things to look out for if they do end up in a situation where they're not able to use sterile water. Like, how do you know when something might be wrong because of that? Like, if you're looking at an infection, like, have the full conversation if that's someone's only option. Let's see. And then lastly, this is just kind of another example of the framework, right? It's so we're talking about injecting, and this is from Katie, it's from Canada. They're a big harm reduction provider and HIV, STI, Hep C treatment provider there. And this is like good, better, best, right? So green, good, less likely to have some serious injuries. Yellow, not great. And then the red areas are places you can really like do some significant damage, and are really risky for like infection. So again, I think checking out some resources to make sure you're able to have extensive conversations about this. And it's a lot, like I know it's a lot. But the more that you can talk about this with people, get yourself familiarized with these resources, the more you're gonna communicate, not just like giving them the empowerment and the options, but the more you're gonna communicate that like you care about their well-being, independent of their substance use status, right? And that's often like where we start with people, especially those that have years of trauma and years of being stigmatized. And I think we're talking about not just people who use drugs, but people who use drugs who are homeless or are unsheltered, and that kind of like compounds that stigma. And so this approach of care and information and empowerment is like huge for people who've experienced that. So I wanted to do a little bit of a case example. And because alcohol is still the most deadly drug in this country, it's about someone who drinks. And so I think we'll read the case study and we'll open it up for a discussion and then talk about some potential interventions that extend a little bit beyond like the harm reduction around actual use into like the harm reduction of helping people remain housed. So George is a 60-year-old single white male. He recently transitioned into his own apartment. He struggles with depression, drinks up to 3 pints a day, which is a lot. He's already had several challenges with neighbors due to his drinking and the guests he invites over, and the smell of marijuana smoke coming from the apartment. The landlord has been involved, like he's shown up and said something, and you're concerned about what this could mean for George's tenancy moving forward. George is clear that he's not ready to stop drinking or socializing, though he's open to potentially cutting back. How would you intervene with George? Like, what are some first things that stand out to you and some approaches you might try?
I think sometimes with smoke, we talk about, possibly getting people to vape if
Yep.
they can. So they can still, I'm not sure, George is 60. I'm not sure if he, physically, if he has any issues ambulating or things like that. So I know I've worked with elderly individuals in the past, and, trying to move towards vaping can really assist in keeping them housed to
Yeah.
avoid those lease violations.
Yes. That's a really great example. And I'm glad it was the first one that was part of the discussion, because that's exactly kind of where we're heading with this discussion. So vaping is one idea. What else do folks think? How would they approach George?
Well, if one problem is the guests, maybe exploring with George about whether there's other places he can go to get the social interaction that he's getting that he wants.
Yeah. Yep, absolutely. Or like, can you work with him on some boundaries with the guests, right? So, hey, I want to have you over, and working on setting limits around like, but if this happens, I have to ask you to leave because I'm not going to jeopardize my housing. So that kind of intervention is harm reduction. Like, this is all harm reduction. Yep, lower percentage alcohols or maybe mixing in some non-alcoholic drinks. Yeah, I think the lower percentage alcohols, like sometimes people don't even, I mean, first, I think making sure you have a sense of what they're really drinking. So if they say 3 beers, like what does 3 beers mean? Is it 3 beers or is it 3 of these ones? And so then you can kind of make more accurate suggestions about how to cut back. But I think lower percentage alcohol, because I think in my experience anyway, people sometimes have a hard time like stopping, and that's part of what perpetuates their challenges with alcohol use. But if you're drinking lower alcohol drinks, you're just going to be less intoxicated over a period of time and better able to make decisions.
Um, with the guests, like this isn't always professionally appropriate, but there are times with permission that you can, and depending on your rapport with like that community, you can talk to the guests about how they're jeopardizing George's housing. And sometimes it can look like a conversation. I mean, I've had people where essentially 4 people live there, and you kind of have this rapport with everybody, and they're nice, fun group of people, and you can kind of appeal to the friends who are visiting and just be like, if you guys aren't out of here. And I even set an alarm on one guy's phone where it's like, when that alarm goes off, like, you guys should split if you really want this guy to have housing. And I think that did help a lot, just making an awareness, because sometimes that individual is just not the kind of person who's going to set boundaries, and you just have to, accept that. But sometimes the people who are visiting actually are pretty intuitive. Yeah, usually a couple of folks are in the group, and
Yeah.
it's worth talking about like that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that would be like you said, when appropriate, that would be a great intervention, right? So if someone's struggling to set limits, you can work on that with them. But while you're doing that, if something is jeopardizing their housing, maybe there is someone you can talk to, or maybe you support them in having that conversation, or, you work with the person on identifying like, okay, so when you do say, I need you to leave, or when you do say, I can't have X in my apartment, who's respecting your boundaries and who's not? And then, so what do we do about that? And so there's like a lot of different ways you can process and intervene when it comes to guests and comes to people's challenges setting limits. Because I think, it's so normal for people to want to have guests or like take people with them that they built strong relationships with when they're outside, and like they don't want to leave them there. And like I understand that as a person, and you don't want them to lose housing and be back in the same situation because of that. And so the interventions around that, the navigation, the exploration of those conversations and situations is great. And I think they should start pretty early on. Any other thoughts about George before we move on? I think we might wrap up a little bit, maybe 15 minutes early today. We'll see. I say that and then I'll talk long time in. Won't happen.
I'll just add, and I know you have to fit the whole case example into one little paragraph, but would always want more information. And without more information, it definitely feels like partially a stigma situation, because we don't know really what the neighbor is being bothered by.
Yep.
So maybe exploring that more, maybe just speaking about that openly.
Yeah, that's a really great point. I think, yes, definitely. I know case examples are always kind of limited, right? But that is a really good point, right? And so one thing you might work on is like, if it is just stigma, like, do you build relationships with your neighbors? Like, do you actually interact with them more versus less? Or is it a situation where like there's something that you can adjust so they would just be bothered less? Or is it a situation where they are not going to come around? And so what do we do about that to like kind of minimize the impact on your housing situation, right? So I think we got most to these, but I think, first and foremost with withhold judgment, it's legal, and so is using marijuana. But I think when it comes to guests, like try to keep folks inside so it's less visible. Try to keep people, I don't know, set a limit on how many people can be in your apartment. Make sure that they are cleaning up cans and bottles every day. One harm reduction type tip I really like is, can you encourage them to use cans instead of bottles because they can take up less space in the trash? They're not as obvious to the landlord. It's not going to tip them off every time they have guests over. Or just kind of like that stigma, right? If they're seeing all these bottles, they're going to make assumptions, and can we minimize that? Remind people that pot has a distinct smell, so that vaping suggestion is a great suggestion. And again, build relationships with your neighbors and your landlord. People are less like that's the way that we can kind of start working on surpassing that stigma and the assumptions people might be making about someone just because they're using certain substances. And it's not always possible. Like some people are not always so movable when it comes to that. But we certainly can take steps in the right direction. These are a bunch of things that we can try to support people in maintaining their housing. Any interventions you feel like we missed or would want to add other than the ones that we've discussed?
I'll just add another one, not necessarily for this person individually, but just as another reminder as to why we support folks to get access to a PCP or get more comfortable with medical providers. We focused a lot today on how to keep people alive in the moment, which is obviously our number one. But the number of folks we've seen with different sorts of infections that lead to blood infections, heart infections, could be reduced if folks are more comfortable going to and speaking with doctors.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I would add to that, even like comfortable speaking to you about it. Like certainly I have had scenarios where people were like embarrassed or they didn't know. Also, I think being informed on what symptoms and signs might look like for your purposes, because I also have had the experience where people are walking around with really bad infections and they don't really realize how serious it is. And like, I don't know, traveling, if you've seen any of these, you may have seen like where kind of like redness is spreading and traveling up towards like your heart. And so again, I would refer back to the National Harm Reduction Coalition set of resources, and I can send after this presentation, I'll pull some that I think were really relevant to the discussion today. So I think recognizing signs and symptoms of infection, safer injection practices, and like the safer use guides by substance, that could be like another whole hour of training probably. But and also just like a lot to digest probably from one training. So to have the resource will probably be helpful. So I'll send those out kind of like worksheets when I send out the evaluation and all of that stuff together in case people are interested in getting a little bit more well versed. Oh, no, not there yet. So I think we are going to be able to wrap up early today, which is great. And I think the first time we've ever wrapped up early from one of these trainings. I feel like we're always scrambling to the end. But I wanted to just kind of leave people, like kind of how we ease people in with a video, kind of leave people with a quote. And the quote, and I love this, it's from Pat Deegan. She is a harm reductionist, but she's also a person with lived experience of schizophrenia who got her doctorate in psychology and now does like enormous work in the harm reduction, I keep doing that, serious mental illness space. around empowerment and around hope and around recovery and like recovery oriented principles. And so I love this quote and I wanted to share it. It is not our job to pass judgment on who will and will not recover from mental illness and or substance use and the spirit-breaking effects of poverty, oppression, stigma, dehumanization, degradation, and learned helplessness. It is our job to form a community of hope which surrounds people. It is our job to create environments that are charged with opportunities for self-improvement. It is our job to nurture staff in their special vocations of hope. It is our job to ask people what it is they want and need in order to grow, and then to provide them with good soil in which new life can secure its roots and grow. And then finally, it is our job to wait patiently, to sit with, watch, and wonder, and to witness with reverence, the unfolding of another person's life. And I think that really, again, like if we could kind of come full circle and bring it back to the spirit of harm reduction, this quote really reflects that for me. And I'm wondering, kind of as a last discussion point and wrap up, what is one thing or the most important thing you are taking away from the training today? And I'll invite those who have not been able to participate for whatever reason to chime in, whether it's in the chat or coming off mute. Radical acceptance. Good. I'm glad that's one of them. That's like really, really important to start all of this work off. Understanding and empathy. Yeah, absolutely. What do other folks think? Yeah, creating a safety plan before transitioning into housing, and what are we talking about in that safety plan? Making sure we're talking about their substance use. Yes, the amazing work Safe Spot is doing. I'm so glad she was able to come join us today and talk about that resource. It really is, I think, a valuable one. And lastly, any questions, thoughts, or comments for me, or anything that you want me to bring back to Kimber if anything came up after she wrapped up her presentation?
Teresa, if you have resources or anything that are like really specific to like programs that like transitional housing, that kind of thing, I'd love to have more examples of how harm reduction is used in those cases kind of specifically, because we have a different program that I'm like this whole program I've been thinking, we should work a little bit to change a little bit differently how we approach that program.
Yeah, I do. Okay, so I'll send that out to the group. Let me make a note because my memory. Let's see.
Kimber is going to send out some supplies to each of our PSHA agencies. I don't know how many, but you can ask for more on top of that.
Yeah, I think she's like eager to get it out to folks. So, and I know they're trying to kind of expand through New England, and so I think they're like really hoping to get the word out, especially they see a special like need in supported housing or people that are transitioning, this kind of like critical point in time in people's lives.
We struggle with rehab, I feel like, here in the state of Vermont. And I know a lot of individuals I work with would like to access more rehab. But the majority are only 2 weeks. And, and now you can't be on methadone for a certain facility. And it's something that I don't know. I'm not sure. I would love to know what's happening more, within the legislature and things like that. And yeah, it's a real barrier for folks. And I always wish I had more, because I have a lot of folks that want and ask me about that resource, about trying to find, they want to go into rehab, but they don't want to end up in a rehab facility for 2 weeks and end up, back out in an unhoused situation. So
Yeah, and thank you for bringing that up, because that like nationally is probably the biggest problem that I hear about. And even when I was doing this work, I was in Massachusetts. We actually have a pretty solid continuum, and there were still so many gaps for people, and those gaps for people that are unsheltered are like, they can be deadly, right? Because they might go back to the environment that they were in, they might have an option. And so uh I absolutely would encourage you to advocate with your legislature. So like some examples of things that have been successful in other states, and maybe I can pull some of this to send out as a resource to advocate for, is um regulations around, and they have to receive certain funding, right? It can't, like, privately owned. There's like not like a lot that we can do about that. Um, but some programs that receive certain funding, like, they cannot say you can't be here if you're on methadone. Like, they are not allowed to do that. And so that's a reg in Massachusetts and a few other states. There was a push for like the licensure of Oxford houses and sober homes in some states. I'll try to think of a few more examples. There's also one thing you can advocate for nationally, which I'm not sure what's going to happen, is the Modernizing Opioid Treatment Act. And so for folks that are on methadone or any kind of MOUD, they've already relaxed a lot of restrictions, but there are more that people are advocating for. Kind of like lessons learned from COVID about what the risks really were and weren't. That would make that a lot more accessible for people. And then even like, it does not solve the problem of those gaps in care, which, like I said, like nationally, that is like number one problem for people who are unsheltered and using drugs. But it does, if they were able to access MOUD, it does reduce their risk, because then at least they have some kind of medication safety net when they do have a gap. And so there's a number of different things. I'll see if I can pull together a bit of a fact sheet maybe for this group. Any other questions, comments before we do in fact wrap up early today?
Thank you for bringing this to us, and certainly for your passion behind it. The life-saving aspects of harm reduction is, we all know it, but we have to keep talking about it in order to feel comfortable in these conversations. I also always want to think about how we use harm reduction across the board. So certainly with people using substances, but it can also be with behavioral addictions. It can be with certain patterns. So thinking about, I really like the best, great, good. I don't even remember them, but like thinking about that for all sorts of things that could add to somebody's vulnerability that we want to support them through.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's part of that dignity and respect thing to give people all the information and support them in making their choices. And that is one way to kind of think about it and have conversations about pros and cons. So yeah. But you're right, it's global. It's not just about people using substances. I know that was like a particular challenge. But there's so much more to talk about there for sure. All right. Guess take 10 minutes back in your day. And thank you so much, everyone, for sticking with us for 3 hours almost.
Thank you. It was really informative. This was a really good training.
Oh, thank you. Glad you found it helpful.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah. Okay, so I'll try to pull some resources together that they were hoping to get.